Another month of the regular season has gone as some of the top teams rebound after lackluster games earlier in the June joust. This week saw more quick 3-0s, but also a lot of very close nail-biters as the teams jostled for the remaining positions in the June joust knockouts. Hey guys, how's it going? My name is Elias and welcome to the Overwatch League Weekly Recap. In this video, we'll be going over the matches this past weekend, partially to talk about how all the teams are faring, but mostly to see how my preseason predictions match up to reality. As such, there is a full spoiler warning for this past week's games, so if you haven't seen them, you may want to wait a bit on this video. We'll be looking at all the scores and how they match up to what I thought before the season even started. Typically, we start off with the roster changes of the week, and this week was a bit quiet on that front, as only the Hangzhou Charge had coaching changes. Since I typically don't talk about the coaching side of the league, I won't. Before we get into the scores this week, I do want to mention the June Joust knockouts that were played this past Sunday. Now, during the May Melee, I included the knockouts with the last week of the regular season games, but I've decided from here on out to keep the tournaments separate, and so I will not be talking much about the knockout games until next week when I will look at both the knockouts and the final games to kind of give that video a little bit more volume. There's already a lot of games to talk about for this week, and adding in 6 more is a little much, and this will usually give me time to get these videos out a little sooner, even if this one's a little bit later than usual. Now with that all out of the way, let's get on to the correct predictions for the week. And this week was a good one, with 5 of the 14 games being completely correct. Starting with Vancouver, both of their games went 3-0 as I predicted, but playing against both the Shock and Dallas Fuel, it was not that big of a prediction. However, I did correctly predict that the Shock Justice game would be a close one, and after the Justice's first week playing in the June Joust, that was a bit of a surprise. Now, I've also correctly predicted in the preseason that the Hunters would be giving Seoul a bit of trouble to another close game, but Seoul did not disappoint and were able to win that game out. And finally, another prediction that I think everyone had, the Spark were able to easily defeat the LA Valiant 3-0. Now, moving on to the games, I got the score wrong but the victor right, and starting in the East, there was a lot of these games. The Guangzhou Charge disappointed me and my predictions as they were not able to get a map off of either the Philly Fusion or the Seoul Dynasty as I predicted, but the Philly Fusion disappointed me even more by allowing the Valiant to take a map off of them. That ruined that prediction and my pick'em. And finally, for the East, I thought that the Chengdu Hunters would have had a little bit of a closer game to the Hangzhou Spark, but the Spark look a lot better in this meta than a lot of the other teams, and were able to handle the Hunters to a little better than I expected, beating them 3-1. As for the West Division, I was wrong on the scoreline for 2 games, both featuring the LA Gladiators, who looked great and were able to defeat both the Boston Uprising and the Paris Eternal, but not dominant enough to prevent either of these teams from taking a map, as both these teams have looked better than I expected in the preseason, that being the Paris Eternal and the Boston Uprising, while the Gladiators have looked comfortable and in control in both these games, but just not dominant enough for that 3-0. And finally, the upsets. This week there was only 3 of them, which is not too bad, and 2 of those featuring the Florida Mayhem. But starting off with the Boston Uprising and the Paris Eternal, these 2 teams that I correctly predicted would be close, but Paris looks a lot stronger than I had thought in the preseason, and were able to edge out the Uprising, which was surprising given the Uprising's first week. I also predicted that the Mayhem would be close in their games against the Dallas Fuel and the Washington Justice. While the game against the Fuel was close, Dallas just barely defeated Florida. The Mayhem did not look good against the Justice, and that was the worst upset this week. Other than that game, this week I think I did pretty good. Now moving on to the individual teams, and starting with the East Division, the teams either won both of their games or lost both of their games for the East Division, so there was no middle ground. So starting with the losing teams, and in no particular order, we have the Guangzhou Charge. Now, the Charge not only went 0-2 for a record this week, but also did not win a single map, although they did draw a map against the Fusion. But this is not a good look. Now, granted, the Charge did play both the Philly Fusion and the Seoul Dynasty, 2 very good teams, but you'd like to see the Charge get at least a map. So, let's start with the good. The Charge are playing a lot of different comps, which is not necessarily a good thing by itself, but they don't look weaker on one comp versus another, and so that's really good. And flexibility is something that I think teams should have to succeed, especially due to the hero pools. Now, both DPS for the Charge continue to look good, especially Choice A1, but Eileen actually looked a lot better this weekend than a lot of other weeks. I've also been impressed with Krong on the off-tank role, and he looked especially good against the Fusion. Now, how did the Charge go to an 0-2, even if they were looking good? Well, I don't think this is entirely on the Charge, as they did play two really good teams, but I did see a lot of bad ult usage from this team, especially Mandu, who was the main support. And the Charge look a little slow to change things that aren't working, such as the Genji pick, which I typically don't like for this meta. I want to see more from this team in general, as it's usually Choi carrying the team for fight wins, and if more of the team can kind of reach that carry potential, then I expect the Charge will start winning more often. Next, for the teams going 0-2, we have the Chengdu Hunters. A bit surprising, but the Hunters struggled this week against both the Spark and the Dynasty. Now, granted, the Spark have looked incredibly comfortable in this meta, and the Dynasty look a lot better this week than they did previously. The Hunters are playing a lot of Orisa, and this meta has kind of showed that the Winston Dive Rush hybrid style is the strongest, so I think Chengdu is struggling a bit from that. But the Hunters didn't look too bad all in all this weekend, just outplayed by their opponents. One major highlight from this weekend was Chengdu's match against the Spark on Voskaya, as that was probably the fastest attack I've ever seen. They had a little bit over 6 minutes by the end of it. And I think that's the fastest attack that we've seen since the assault map changes a bit ago. I think it was like last year or so. I don't remember exactly. We also saw Kaneki play a lot this weekend for the Hunters, and he looked good on the Reaper and the Tor, but I wasn't really impressed by anything else he was trying to play, including a really poor showing on the Genji. And while he had a decent Hangzhou, aim-wise was great, but he had really bad ult usage with the Dragons. Now, Leave continues to be one of the best players for the Hunters, as does Gaga, but I'm less impressed with the Hunter supports. While Monk is good, he has some very poor ult usage decisions, and Nisha looks alright, but especially on the Mercy, but does get picked a lot. All in all, I like watching Chengdu, as you never know what they're going to be playing, but they do look fairly inconsistent. And finally, for the teams that did not get a win this weekend, we have the LA Valiant. Now, I doubt many expected anything else. The Valiant were able to get a map off of the Fusion, so there is some bright spots on this team, but overall, they are one of the weakest teams in the league. Now, both Crystal and Moloran, the DPS, looked good, and Waya continues to be, Ruya, I believe is how you pronounce it, continues to be a great Ana. But typically the Valiant require Shocheng to have a really good map for them to win. And while that does happen on occasion, and Shocheng does look pretty good most of the time, the Valiant just aren't able to get that consistently. Valiant did try playing Hog this week, and it doesn't typically look good. The Valiant did not look good playing it all that well. Honestly, I think one of the biggest problems with this team is the main tank Silver 3, who just kind of looks outclassed. Part of the reason that Wuya is getting so many nanos so quickly is the tanks are taking a ton of damage, but it's very rare that Silver 3 gets any good usage out of the nano. I wonder what would happen if they started nanoing Moloran's Echo a little bit more, as that might be better, and we've seen some teams do that a little bit more often, nanoing the DPS rather than the tank to do more work. So yeah, I think that would be better, but this team is struggling to get maps, and they're very inconsistent. I don't have too much hope that this team is going to get that first win. Now, for the winning teams, there were 3 teams this weekend that went 2-0. We have the Philadelphia Fusion, the Seoul Dynasty, and the hosts of the first homestand in China this year, the Hangzhou Spark. Starting with Philly, the Fusion did not look good the first week of the June Joust, but they've certainly improved and look a lot better this week. Granted, the Fusion defeated the Charge and the Valiant, 2 of the weaker teams, and they were teams that the Philly was kind of expected to beat, even if they weren't doing well. But seeing this team recover is good. A lot of that, I think, goes to EQO, who we saw return to the league and looked good on the Echo and pretty much whatever he was playing. Now, I've never really been a huge fan of EQO. I recognize that he's good, but I never really thought that he's a top-tier player. and I'm still not overhyped on him, especially when he plays Mei. I'm very critical on his Mei as he loses. I think he lost all of his Mei ults to Divas this weekend. But him playing does try to change the dynamic of the team. It allows Rascal to play other things, as well as just kind of bringing in a new presence to the team. Sometimes that little bit of a change does a lot for a team that had a bad week. So Philly looks fresh again, and Alarm continues to be a really huge force on this team, as well as Hoppa. Hoppa actually had a good showing this weekend. So I think things are looking up for the Fusion. So next up, the Seoul Dynasty also had a rough first week, but look a lot better this weekend. And that is, I think, mostly due to Tuyu being back in the roster. Now, I'm not saying that Tuyu is clutching things or looks particularly dominant, but not that he didn't look good. He actually looked really good this weekend, shutting down Eileen's Genji from the charge completely, but mostly because Tuyu being in the game means that Seoul is playing more reasonable comps. They're playing a lot of Orisa comps, but also a lot of ball dive. I don't think Gesture picked Roadhog at all this week, which is really good. Seoul looks a lot better for it, but they're still trying to do some weird comp things. This time with the DPS, as Prophet's playing a lot of Mei, and it's just not really working. I don't think Mei is really kind of fit for this meta, and I'd much rather see him playing. I'd much rather see him playing something else, and I want to see Seoul play more of the Reaper Echo, especially with the Winston dive. See that rush dive combo hybrid comp played a little bit more from Seoul, and I think they'd be really good. Gesture is a very good Winston, but he didn't really play much Winston this week. So that being said, both Fitz and Prophet continue to play very well, and Fitz especially carries this team so many fights. Seoul looks good, but I think they need to stop thinking so much and just play to their strengths, because there is a lot of strength on this team. And finally, for the East Division, the Hangzhou Spark. Now, if you were not aware, the Spark hosted the Chinese teams this weekend for a live event with the Korea-based teams playing remotely. And it was incredibly nice hearing crowd reactions during the game. Now, the Spark themselves look incredibly strong in this meta, and I think a lot of that goes to Shy and his Echo play being top tier. Spark is also one of the few teams playing a lot more of the double bubble style comp, so the Winston Zarya. And Bernard is a really good Zarya, so it typically does well. But they do like playing the dive comps in general. Gushui is a very good Winston, so it's not too surprising for that. Architect also returned to the stage and did quite well. And all in all, the DPS and the tanks for the Spark are putting on a good show and playing well overall. I felt that the Spark were going to be one of the top teams, close to the top, but looking into the top teams in the preseason. But they've really shown this month that the Spark can compete for that top spot, and they're more than capable of beating any team in the East. Now, with the qualifiers finished for the June Joust, the Hangzhou Spark, Shanghai Dragons, Seoul Dynasty, and New York Excelsior, ranked in that order, qualified for the knockouts, and while those games did occur this weekend, I'm going to wait until next week to discuss the knockouts with the rest of the June Joust. Moving on to the West Division, things are a little more back and forth as a couple of teams actually went 1-1. It wasn't just, 2-0s and 0-2s like the East Division. But three teams did go 2-0 this weekend: the Dallas Fuel, Los Angeles Gladiators, and the San Francisco Shock. Starting with the Fuel, the DPS lineup for the Dallas Fuel continues to be insane, especially Sparkle on the Echo, as his Diva duplicates do so much every time. Now, Dallas has had a bit of a trouble with the Florida Mayhem, and a lot of that is just because Florida is also a good team, but Dallas' support line sometimes struggles, especially Jeske, and especially with ult usage. Now, this team is a very clutch team, and the temptation to invest in lost fights to try to turn things is a real concern, and oftentimes it does work, but sometimes it just makes this team look a lot worse. I like seeing Dallas invest in fights to try to turn things, but I just want to see the supports be a little bit more reserved with their ults a little bit more often. But that being said, both Fearless and Hanbin look great on the tank line, and Doha's Reaper is nothing to scoff at. Dallas continues to look like one of the top, if not the top, team in the league. Next up, the LA Gladiators also went 2-0, and this team is surprisingly good. Kevster is a real highlight of the Gladiators, as is Birdring, and I will always sing the praises of Space on the off-tank. This weekend, Shu especially did a ton of work and had a really good weekend. Really helped the Gladiators win multiple maps. Now, the Gladiators do show more than just dive, which is always nice, and overall the Gladiators look comfortable, but they really haven't been able to look dominant like some of the other top teams. The Gladiators are clutch, but they kind of look on the verge of losing some maps, just kind of constantly look like any fight could go the other way, and that's not something you want to see. I still expect the Gladiators to keep winning, and hopefully they'll start looking a little bit more dominant against some of the weaker teams in the West moving forward. And finally, for the 2-0 teams, the San Francisco Shock look like a top team as usual. The Shock had a tough game this week, playing a revitalized Washington Justice, but they were able to clutch out the win. The DPS for the Shock look amazing, especially Striker on the Reaper, and the tank line with either Super or Smurf continues to look good, and especially Smurf on the Winston. But it's also really nice seeing the Shock play more of Glister, who is an amazing hit scan and continues to produce really good clips of just headshots and all that. He was a little bit more quiet this weekend, but still looks amazing. But this Shock team is not immortal, as the supports, especially FD God, gets picked early a lot of times, which leads to lost team fights and then leads to lost maps. The Shock are a very aggressive team, particularly on defense, and that has cost them in the past. But nevertheless, they are a top team. There's no doubt about that. It's just a matter of if they can best the other teams to get to the finals of the tournaments. Now, continuing on to the 1-1 teams, we have the Paris Eternal and the Washington Justice. Starting with Paris, this team has really surprised me so far this year, as they look a lot better than I thought in the preseason, even with the roster changes to main support and the off-tank. Both Drijo and Vestola look great on this roster. But one of the main heroes for me are interesting ones. So Don on the main tank is probably one of the few people playing Roadhog this at times, but I actually approve of his Roadhog, as he really only plays it in specific situations, and it catches a lot of teams off guard. He really likes playing it first point of assault maps, especially Voskaya. Next, Naga on the DPS looked absolutely fantastic this past weekend and did incredible work. And the last hero of this team that's kind of surprising is Khan on the support. He is incredibly, especially when he's playing Ana. Paris is a team that is definitely not a top team, but they look really good, all things considered, and I kind of expect to see more out of them this season. The Washington Justice also looked a lot better this weekend after a really bad first week in the June Joust, and I think a lot of that goes to Decay. Now, I know that there's always been questions when Decay is not played due to his past, whether there are issues behind the scenes or whatnot, but his performance this weekend makes that kind of talk really not matter. Decay is a lot of why the Justice looked good this week, and even though they went 1-1, they completely shut out a good Florida Mayhem and gave the San Francisco Shock a run for their money. Mag also looked a lot better this weekend, both on the Winston and the Orisa. I was kind of impressed by his Orisa, because sometimes main tank players, Orisas are usually either really good or just kind of good. And there's a few that look bad, but Mag actually looks really good on Orisa. And Assassin also looks really good on the Echo. But the Justice do have a bit of an ult usage problem, investing way too many ults that just don't get any use, or more importantly, investing ults while they're retreating. They did that a lot this weekend, and it cost them. And it's mainly a problem of the supports, and it's something that we're really seeing throughout the league, but it needs to be fixed. The Justice definitely showed that they are a top team, but I just hope they can figure out whatever roster issues or decisions or whatever is going on behind the scenes and play the best players, and I think they'll be a strong team. And finally, the teams this week that went 0-2 were the Boston Uprising, the Florida Mayhem, and the Vancouver Titans. Starting with the Boston Uprising, this weekend really surprised me and ruined my pick'ems. Boston looked so much better the first week of the June Joust, beating teams that many expect to be top teams 3-0. But this week, they just did not look nearly as good. Starting with the good, Gabolsi on the off-tank continues to impress, and Valentine on the Echo looks good. Mombong on support also continues to look really good, and I don't think I've ever really had too much of a problem with him. But Boston, I think, is just struggling to work as a together as a team. The Uprising has looked like a really aggressive team, but unlike Shock, who is probably the most aggressive team in the league, they really haven't been able to make that aggression turn into wins. And a large part of this, I think, is due to Boston attacking teams as a six-stack head-on, just kind of holding W and hoping to win fights. But dive comps really need a player to attack from the flanks to get damage done, and that head-on attack tends to make Boston overextend, which costs them. There's a lot of talent on this team, but I think there's a big lack of understanding of how these comps work that is hurting Boston more than anything. It's definitely a fixable problem, but unless the Uprising starts thinking more about how to play their comp or attack an opposing comp, they'll continue to struggle. There's a lot of, you can't just run headfirst into the enemy. You've got to kind of flank around. And if we see them do that, then I think they'll look a little bit better. But it's hard to tell because what the meta will be next month is up in the air. Now, the Florida Mayhem definitely struggled this week, losing a hard-fought match against the Dallas Fuel and being completely slaughtered by the Washington Justice. Now, despite losing both games, Florida did look good, mostly against the Fuel, and both Yaki and BQB on the DPS looked great. Yaki, interestingly, likes to duplicate the opposing Reaper as Echo, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but typically we've seen duplicated Divas do a lot more work. And that was a big difference in the Fuel game, as duplicated Reaper is not going to have fun against two Divas. Florida just pretty much exclusively plays dive, and typically they play dive well, but they're just not decisive enough to finish off team fights before the reinforcements show up, and then they end up losing that fight. I think they're going to have a couple of weeks to recuperate, and I think they'll be able to recover from a relatively lackluster June, and I do hope to see good things from this team moving forward, and I think we can. Florida has shown that they are a good team. They just need to kind of regroup and come back stronger. And finally, another team that's really had a rough time this month, the Vancouver Titans continue to struggle, again not winning a single map this week. They went 3-0 in both of their matches, and while they're clearly a bottom team, they did have a really rough schedule in June, playing the Shock and Fuel this week, which I don't think surprises anyone that they didn't get a map win. That being said, this team is looking a lot better. I was actually pretty impressed with how they are playing. Granted, I don't think the Shock were playing super hard against them, and I don't think the Fuel was either, but the Titans do look a little bit better. They brought Dalton in on the DPS, and he looked really good, and Changsik on the main tank is doing quite well. The Titans do have some issues with support ults and decision-making in general, but this team looks a lot better this weekend than they did last weekend. Now, whether the Titans or the London Spitfire will be the first team, the first of the two winless teams in the West to get that first win is up in the air, but I think it's going to be mostly dependent on the schedule. I feel a little bit more confident in the Titans after this week, despite their poor score. And finally, like the East, we're not going to talk too much about the knockouts for the West Division, keeping that for next week with the rest of the June joust, but the 6 teams that qualified for the knockouts, in ranked order, were the Los Angeles Gladiators, San Francisco Shock, Atlanta Reign, Houston Outlaws, Dallas Fuel, and the Boston Uprising. And that's all I have for you this week. Now, at the time of recording this, the tournament for the June Joust has already started, so we are a bit late this week. Someday I will get these recaps done by Wednesday, but this time I do have a good excuse as it was my girlfriend's birthday this week, so my time to work on this was a little bit less. Nevertheless, we'll be back next week looking at both the knockouts from this past weekend as well as the tournament that's happening this weekend. So thank you all for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you guys next time. Bye!